Is there anything quite as satisfying as a really smooth focus pull? I mean, honestly, probably lots of things, but since I'm a huge gear nerd, it's up there for sure.
You weird, buddy.
Years ago, while I was shooting my first feature documentary, I did something that terrified me. I spent $8,000 on a set of manual focus cinema zooms. At that time, I was living in Mexico and working a ton as a DP for hire, and most of my jobs were moving too fast for me to use primes most of the time. And I was getting frustrated with the tiny little focus pulls of stills lenses. Plus, I was starting to notice that as my jobs got bigger and bigger, directors started to give me these worried looks when I busted out my old Nikon 24-70 as my main working lens. So I spent hours and hours on YouTube trying to find the best professional level zooms for my Sony cameras, and finally I settled on these, the Fujinon MK zooms. There was probably about 10 seconds of pure joy when I hit the buy button, and that followed pretty quickly by fear and doubt about whether or not I'd done the right thing. In this video, I'm gonna go over what I like and don't like about these lenses, but even though we're talking about these Fujinons, this isn't exactly a lens review. I'm gonna go into detail about these lenses for sure, but more than that, I'm gonna share my thoughts about whether or not it's worth it to invest in professional grade lenses, or if it was all a waste of money. Hey guys, welcome back, and if you're new here, my name is Luke Forsyth, and on this channel, I teach the skills I've learned over 10 years working as a documentary filmmaker and photographer. Okay, so before I get into these lenses themselves, let me set the context a bit and why I would even think about getting lenses like this in the first place. I was living in Mexico and working full-time as a documentary DP. Because I was based in Mexico City, owning gear was an important part of my business model because rentals and imports were really expensive for the mostly New York-based production companies I was working for. Then one day, I got a huge job offer to shoot a feature doc that was shooting around the country for 4 straight months. I started the gig with the same photo lenses I'd been using for most of my video career to that point, which was mainly the 18-35 Sigma 1.8, which I absolutely love and still have to this day, but shooting so much day after day, I really started to feel the places where those lenses were lacking. The focus throw was tiny and the range wasn't amazing, and the image just looked a little too clinical and sharp for my taste. There's nothing wrong with the lens, it's still one of my all-time favorites, but when you're shooting for 4 months straight, you start to notice when your gear just isn't quite up to the standard that's expected of you. By that time, I'd been shooting at a pretty high level, and I started to notice also that producers and directors were looking at my setup with a bit of suspicion, as they weren't really used to seeing stills lenses on their multi-million-dollar productions. I wish I could say that things like this don't matter, but even at the professional level, it's a shallow world out there and appearances do count for something. Like any good filmmaker would, I started going down some YouTube rabbit holes looking for the best documentary zoom lenses, and eventually I narrowed it down to a few choices, including these Fuji lenses. There were a bunch of factors that led to me actually pulling the trigger and buying them, which I'll get into in a second, but before anyone gets out there and gets tempted to start filling up B&H shopping carts, I want to say something really important, and that's that I could afford them. Buying new gear won't get you work, so please never buy gear on credit because that's always a bad idea. I'd been working a ton and saving a lot, and I also had a 4-month shoot on the books, and I knew I could rent them out, so I knew I'd get my money back quickly. Going into debt for gear, no matter how nice it is never the right move. Just wanted to get that out of the way. Anyways, I ended up going for it, and while I waited for them to ship, I got a pretty bad case of filmmakers' anxiety, and I was terrified that I'd made the wrong choice. But when I got my hands on them and actually started shooting with them, that went away and I fell in love with them. Now it's been 6 years with these guys, I think, and I have no plans to replace them anytime soon. But would I recommend something like this for others out there? Before I get into that, let me just give you a quick breakdown of what these are. There's 2 lenses in this set, and they're for Sony E-mount only. There's the 18-55 and the 50-135, and you can buy them individually or in a set for a bit of a saving. They're also Super 35 only, so it's actually more like a 24-70 and a 70-200, which makes them a pretty useful pair. At the time, the set cost just under $8,000 with taxes and shipping. Essentially, they're the baby brothers of the Fujinon Cabrio, which is a really popular lens for higher budget productions, and it's something of an industry standard for run and gun cinema zooms, but it's about $25,000 and it's super heavy, and at that time, there was no way I was ready to commit to something like that. So let's get into the pros and cons of these because, like I said, I was shooting almost every day, so I got to know them pretty fast. Let's start with the good. The main thing for me is the fact that they're full manual and the focus pull is incredibly smooth and easy to dial in. These lenses don't do autofocus, but for me, that's okay because outside of these YouTube videos and some gimbal work, I really don't use autofocus very much. And for me, the long focus throw is much more important than autofocus. Stills lenses are pretty much designed to be used with autofocus, so they're really sensitive and just a tiny little turn of the ring and you'll change the plane completely. When you're working in 4K or higher these days, if you miss focus by even a little bit, it is super obvious and the shot looks terrible. So for me, it's a big problem. If I'm trying to cover a scene and like flow with the action, if I have to worry about blowing past my focal point with a 2mm turn of the ring, it's not great. These things though have a really great level of play to them, so I can move with my subjects and smoothly transition between different parts of a scene. The aperture ring is also fully manual, which I love because I can make small adjustments to exposure without it looking super jarring like you get with the hard stop changes you have to make with most photo lenses. They're also really lightweight for what they are, and that's partly because they're E-mount only, though I think they're now making versions in other mounts like R-mount and maybe they're interchangeable, I'm not quite sure. But for some people that might be a con, and I guess it sort of is for me too, but all my cameras are Sony and it looks like it's gonna stay that way for a while still, so the savings in weight are worth it. The Cabrio Big Brother lens weighs almost 10 pounds, which can make the camera incredibly front heavy and annoying to carry around in rough environments. These are only 2 pounds, which is pretty crazy and very comparable to a stills lens. They're also parfocal, which basically means that if you set them up properly, you can keep the same thing in focus even as you zoom in and out. That can be extremely useful when you're trying to cover a scene as a solo operator because you can move in and out really quickly without having to refocus every time. Or during an interview, if you want to punch in for a cutaway, you don't have to readjust focus. Now that's not a requirement in lenses for me necessarily, but it's definitely a nice bonus. Now let's talk about the fun stuff, the image quality. We all know that lenses matter just as much, if not more than the camera, and I can see a difference in these lenses compared to my old lenses. I'm not a pixel peeper, so I won't bore you with details about sharpness and chromatic aberration, but they just look better than any of the other lenses in my kit. They're really organic feeling without being too vintage, and they're clean and sharp without looking too digital. They flare nicely, the bokeh looks super smooth, and they're really sharp without being clinical. I love a good vintage lens, but on most paid jobs, to be honest, clients don't want something so stylized. For me, they're the perfect balance between natural and polished. Last is the build quality, because even though these things are super light, they don't feel cheap at all. They're solid. They feel great in the hands, and I've put them through more abuse than I can even remember, including shooting with them every single day for 4 months while living in a tent and filming in all sorts of weather conditions from dust to snow to rain. And sorry to keep talking about these focus rings, but seriously, these smooth turns are just so satisfying when you interact with something every day.
You're weird!
I'm curious, does design and the physical appearance of camera gear matter to you guys? Let me know. Now let's look at some of the negatives because they're not perfect. The first one I already mentioned, and that's that they're E-mount only. Though, like I said, I'm pretty sure they're making them for Canon R-mount too. For me, E-mount isn't a problem, but if you're shooting with Panasonic or Blackmagic or something, then obviously this is an issue. Next is the price, because spending the price of a used car on 2 highly stealable, highly breakable camera lenses is not something to take lightly. So lenses like these only make sense if you're working regularly, and they're not a good choice for new filmmakers just starting out, unless you have very deep pockets and want the best. Lastly is the elephant in the room, and that's that they're Super 35 only. That might sound like a massive problem in the age of full-frame mirrorless cameras, but it's actually not that weird. Lots of the all-time great cinema lenses like Cooke S4s or Zeiss Super Speeds and many others only cover Super 35. It's actually one of the reasons why I bought an FX9 instead of an FX6, because the 9 has a Super 35 mode and the 6 doesn't, which really limits the lenses I can use on them. So if you're only running on mirrorless full-frame cameras, these lenses are not for you. But this isn't just about whether or not you should get these specific lenses, because there are lots of other options out there from people like Sigma or DZO. Some are cheaper and some are way more expensive. What this video is about is whether or not investing in professional workhorse cinema lenses is worth it, or if you should just stick to the photo lenses you already have. For me, investing in cinema zooms is worth it if you're shooting a lot, and more importantly, getting paid for it. They're especially useful for small teams working in run and gun situations, because just 2 lenses can cover pretty much all your normal needs while weighing under 5 pounds combined, so you can get high-end results in some really remote locations. If you want to invest in workhorse lenses that can do almost everything and you have the volume of work work to support it, then yes, these are absolutely worth it. They're not worth it if you shoot full frame only or if you have to buy on credit. And I'll just say it one more time for good measure, never ever buy gear on credit unless you can pay it off really fast. So would I buy these lenses again? Well, yes and no. I would absolutely buy the 18-55 again, but honestly, I would probably skip the 50-135. Don't get me wrong, it's a wonderful lens and it's great for B-roll, and now that I have it, I'm really happy. But for the amount of time it's actually on the camera, it's not nearly as good a value for money ratio as the 18-55, which I have shot hundreds and hundreds of hours with. I have no plans to get rid of this one, but if I were buying again, I'd just get the 18-55 to start and then see. There's also some really solid alternatives from companies like DZO and Sure that are cheaper. There's also the 18-35 Cine from Sigma that's about the same price, and others like the Canon 15-20 or Cabrio 19-90 or Angenieux 21-56 that are like way more. So it's definitely not like these are the only cinema zooms out there. For me, as a primarily Sony shooter who values lightweight as well as image quality and design, these ones made the most sense. Investing in lenses like these is something that's totally worth it, but only if you can put them to work. So get rid of the idea that a pro cinema zoom will help you tell an amazing story, because it won't. You have to be able to do that with any lens and then invest in something like this when you're ready. And then love them every single day. If you guys like this sort of deep dive into gear, I'm getting close to releasing my documentary cinematography course, and there's gonna be an entire unit dedicated to gear. Everything from lenses to lights to grip and a ton more. The course is gonna cover a lot more than gear though, and I'm gonna go into how to build a career as a doc DP, the business skills you need, creative things like scene coverage and visual storytelling, plus interviews with other high-end industry DPs and directors to figure out how they made this weird career work, and really just sharing everything I've learned doing this job for the last 10 years. So if you're interested in the cinematography aspects of doc filmmaking and want the most comprehensive course out there about the shooting side of things, I'll link below and you can get on the waitlist, which will also get you a discount when it's released. I'm hoping to get it done by the end of this summer, and it's gonna have really limited enrollment for the first intake, so getting on that list early is a good idea if you're interested. See ya.